If you enjoy the story, please support by subscribing to the channel. Thank you. Now let's begin. I've always loved books. That's probably why I stayed in my tiny dead-end job at that musty old bookstore for so long. It wasn't glamorous, and the pay barely covered my rent. But there was something comforting about being surrounded by rows and rows of dusty paperbacks, the smell of old pages, and the quiet hum of the shop's dim lighting. That's how I spent most of my days, alone, working behind the counter, thumbing through the same dog-eared books I'd read 100 times. Customers were rare, and when they did come in, it was usually just to browse the shelves without buying anything. Until one evening, it was near closing time, and the sun had already set, casting long shadows over the deserted street outside. I was packing up, getting ready to lock up for the night, when I heard the faint chime of the doorbell. I looked up, half expecting to see one of the few regulars who wandered in from time to time, but the person standing in the doorway wasn't anyone I recognized. It was an older man, tall and thin, his skin pale as paper, with gray hair that hung loosely around his face. He wore a dark coat that looked too heavy for the mild weather, and there was something about his presence that immediately set me on edge. He didn't belong here, not in this run-down bookstore, not in this quiet part of town. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the eerie silence of the shop. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft click. His eyes scanned the shelves, his face expressionless, and for a moment, I wondered if he was lost. "I'm looking for a book," he said, his voice low and steady. "Any book in particular?" I asked, feeling a bit more at ease. This was normal enough. People came in looking for books all the time, though something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. The man smiled, a small, unsettling smile. "It's not a book you'd have on your shelves." I frowned, glancing at the shelves filled with all kinds of rare, obscure titles. "I can special order anything," I said, "but we have a pretty good selection here. What's the title?" He stepped closer to the counter, his eyes locking onto mine. "It's called The Midnight Library." I blinked, the name sounding vaguely familiar, though I couldn't place it. "I've never heard of it," I admitted. "What's it about?" His smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's not a book for just anyone," he said. "Only a select few receive the invitation." My unease grew. "Invitation?" I repeated, confused. He reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small envelope, yellowed with age, the paper brittle at the edges. He slid it across the counter toward me, his pale fingers lingering on the corner for a moment before letting go. I stared at the envelope, hesitant to touch it. There was something off about this whole situation, something I couldn't put my finger on, but curiosity got the better of me, and I picked it up. The envelope felt old, fragile, like it might disintegrate in my hands. There was no name, no address, just a wax seal on the back, a symbol I didn't recognize, a crescent moon, surrounded by strange, looping lines that looked almost like letters but not quite. "What is this?" I asked, turning the envelope over in my hands. "It's your invitation," the man said, his voice soft. "To the Midnight Library." I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the growing unease. "I think you've got the wrong person." But the man didn't laugh. He just stood there, watching me with those cold, unreadable eyes. "You've been chosen," he said simply. "The library is waiting." Before I could respond, the man turned and walked toward the door, his movements slow and deliberate. He opened it without a word, the bell chiming softly as he stepped outside into the night. I rushed to the door, pushing it open to follow him, but when I looked out onto the street, he was gone. There was no sign of him, no footsteps, no shadow, nothing. Just the empty, quiet street, stretching out before me, the streetlights flickering faintly in the distance. I stood there for a moment, the cold night air prickling my skin. trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was that man? And what was this midnight library he was talking about? I looked down at the envelope in my hand, the wax seal still intact. I could feel something inside, thin, like paper, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to open it. I turned and locked the door to the shop, the keys rattling in my trembling hand. My mind was racing, and despite my better judgment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to know what was inside that envelope. So, sitting at the counter, under the dim, flickering lights of the bookstore, I broke the seal. Inside was a small, handwritten note, the paper yellowed and brittle, just like the envelope. The writing was elegant, but old-fashioned, like something out of another century. The note read, "You are invited to the Midnight Library. Midnight, sharp. Bring nothing but yourself. Come alone. You'll know where to find us." That was it. No address, no explanation. Just an invitation to something I had never heard of, and a command to come alone. I stared at the note for a long time, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what this midnight library was, or why I had been invited, but one thing was certain. This was no ordinary invitation. The note was still clutched in my hand long after the stranger had disappeared, its strange message replaying in my mind. Midnight. Bring nothing. Come alone. You'll know where to find us. Those words stuck with me, unsettling and cryptic. How was I supposed to know where this midnight library was? I didn't know anything about it. The idea that I'd just magically know where to go felt absurd. But as the hours ticked by, I couldn't stop thinking about it. No matter how much I tried to tell myself it was a prank or some weird joke, something about that man, about the way he'd looked at me, left me with the gnawing sense that this was real. It was almost midnight now, the shop long closed, and I still hadn't decided what to do. A normal person would have thrown the note away and forgotten the whole thing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was happening here. Something that was meant for me. Something I couldn't ignore. I glanced at the clock. 11:47 p.m. I stood up from the counter, the note crumpled in my hand, and slipped on my jacket. I didn't know what I was doing, or where I was going, but I had to see for myself. I had to find out if the Midnight Library really existed. I stepped out of the bookstore and into the night. The street was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the streetlights overhead. I felt a chill creep up my spine as I walked, the shadows lengthening as I moved away from the lights and toward the darker parts of town. I didn't know why, but something was pulling me in that direction, guiding my steps. It was like I was being drawn to something I couldn't see, but could feel. The night air grew colder as I turned down an alleyway, the buildings looming tall and dark on either side. My heart raced, every instinct telling me to turn back, but I didn't. I kept walking. By now, the city had emptied out. No cars, no people, just me and the growing darkness. My footsteps echoed softly against the pavement, the sound of them making the silence all the more unsettling. I checked my phone. 11:56 p.m. I stopped at the end of the alley, my breath visible in the frigid air, and looked around. This place wasn't familiar. It was a part of town I had never been to before. Yet somehow, I felt like I had been here all along, as if I was meant to arrive at this exact spot. My eyes were drawn to a building across the street, a squat, dark structure that I hadn't noticed at first. There was nothing remarkable about it, just a door, no windows, no sign. But as I stared at it, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. That's when I saw it. In the dim glow of the streetlight, there was a faint shimmer, just above the door, a small brass plaque I hadn't noticed before. I squinted, leaning closer. The letters, though faint, were unmistakable. Midnight Library. My breath caught in my throat. I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. How had I not seen this before? The plaque looked like it had been there for years, weathered and old. And yet, just moments ago, I could have sworn there was nothing there. This was it, the Midnight Library. For a brief moment, I considered walking away. This was insane. Why was I even here? But curiosity, and something deeper, something I couldn't quite name, kept me rooted to the spot. I checked my phone again. 11:59 p.m. 1 minute to midnight. Without thinking, I walked across the street toward the door. My footsteps felt too loud in the quiet, the weight of what I was doing pressing down on me with each step. When I reached the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. What was I expecting to find? A library in some forgotten part of town? A room full of books? Or something worse? The door creaked as I pushed it open. It wasn't locked, which sent another shiver down my spine. Whoever was in there, they had been expecting me. The air inside was different, thicker, colder. I could feel the change the moment I stepped through the doorway. The space was dark, and the only light coming from a dim chandelier hanging in the center of the room. The floor was covered in old, worn carpet, and the walls were lined with tall, wooden bookshelves that stretched all the way up to the ceiling. Books, hundreds, maybe thousands of them, packed the shelves, their spines cracked and worn with age. But there was something off about them, something I couldn't quite place. It felt like the books themselves were watching me, like they were waiting. I stepped further inside, my eyes scanning the room. The space was larger than I had expected, almost impossibly large. From the outside, the building had seemed small, nondescript, but in here, the ceiling was high. The shelves, stretching into shadowy corners that seemed to extend far beyond what should have been possible. I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone else, just me and the books. A clock somewhere in the room chimed softly. Midnight. I swallowed hard, the sound sending a chill down my spine. That's when I noticed something odd. At the far end of the room, near the back of the library, there was a single book sitting on a pedestal. Unlike the others, this one was new, untouched by time. The cover gleamed faintly in the dim light, and from where I stood, I could see there was no title on the front, just the same crescent moon symbol I had seen on the wax seal of the invitation. I walked toward it, my heart pounding louder with each step. The closer I got, the colder the air became. I could feel something shifting around me, like the very air in the room was alive, moving. When I reached the pedestal, I hesitated. There was something about that book, something dangerous, something wrong, but the pull was too strong to ignore. My hand hovered over the cover for a moment, trembling, before I finally picked it up. The instant my fingers touched the book, the entire room seemed to change. The shadows deepened. The light from the chandelier flickered, and I felt a sudden wave of cold sweep through me. I opened the book. The pages were blank. I flipped through them, one after another, but there was nothing. Just empty white pages. No writing, no illustrations, nothing. That's when I heard it. A soft, low whisper, barely more than a breath, coming from somewhere deep within the library. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. The whisper came again, louder this time. It was a voice, soft, eerie, and it was calling my name. I looked up, my eyes scanning the room, but there was no one there, just the rows of bookshelves, the flickering lights, and the cold, suffocating air pressing in around me. The voice whispered my name again, and this time, it was closer, much closer. The voice whispered my name again, closer this time, as if someone was standing just behind me, speaking directly into my ear. My whole body stiffened, a chill running down my spine. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. The library was still empty. The rows of books stood silent, the shadows stretching across the shelves. But the air felt different now, heavier, like something, or someone, was there with me, lurking just out of sight. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. No answer. Just silence. But the whisper had been real. I wasn't imagining it. I could still hear the soft echo of it in my mind, the way it had curled around my name. So quiet, yet so distinct. I glanced down at the book in my hands, the one with the crescent moon symbol. The pages were still blank, the white paper almost glowing in the dim light. But as I stared at it, something strange began to happen. Words appeared. They started faintly at first, like they were being written in real time, the letters forming slowly across the page. My heart pounded as I watched the ink flow, spelling out something that made the blood drain from my face. It was my name, written neatly, perfectly in the center of the page. I took a step back, my hands trembling, but I couldn't bring myself to drop the book. The ink continued to spread, forming words beneath my name, sentences that I couldn't look away from. "You have been chosen." The words were simple, but the weight of them pressed down on me like a lead blanket. My heart raced as the ink continued to spread across the page, forming a story, my story. I watched in horror as the book described everything that had happened that night. The man in the bookstore, the invitation, the walk through the alley. It was all there, written in eerie, flowing script, as if the book had been watching me. "We are waiting for you." I slammed the book shut, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped it. The whispering voice came again, soft but insistent, curling around me like smoke. I turned to leave, my legs trembling beneath me. But the moment I moved toward the door, the lights in the library flickered and went out. I was plunged into total darkness, the silence so heavy I could barely breathe. For a long moment, I stood frozen, my mind racing, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. The only sound was my own ragged breathing, echoing in the blackness. Then I heard it again. The whisper. "We are here." I spun around, desperate to find some source of light, some way out of this nightmare, but the darkness was suffocating, pressing in from all sides. My hand fumbled for my phone in my pocket, praying that the flashlight would work, but when I pulled it out, the screen was dead. Just like before. No power, no signal. I was trapped. The whispering grew louder now, more insistent, and I could feel the presence of something moving through the library. Something unseen, circling me, watching me. I stumbled backward, my hands gripping the book tightly, and I could feel the air shift around me. It was as if the very walls of the library were closing in, shrinking the space, forcing me deeper into the dark. Suddenly, a faint glow appeared ahead of me, dim but unmistakable. It flickered at the far end of the library, where the rows of shelves seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. My body moved, before my mind could catch up, and I found myself walking toward the light, my footsteps slow, hesitant. As I approached, the glow grew brighter, and I realized it was coming from a single lantern, placed on the floor at the base of a towering bookshelf. The light cast eerie shadows on the walls, the flickering flame casting long, distorted shapes that danced across the room. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. There was something wrong about the light, something unnatural, but I had no other choice. I couldn't stay in the dark any longer. I reached down and picked up the lantern, the warmth of the flame offering a small sense of comfort. But as I lifted it, the light revealed something I hadn't noticed before. A door. It was hidden at the very back of the library, nestled between the towering bookshelves, almost invisible in the shadows. The wood was old, warped, and the handle was rusted, like it hadn't been used in years. But what caught my attention was the symbol carved into the door, The same crescent moon that had been on the envelope. The same symbol from the book. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. The whispers had gone quiet now, the air around me still and thick with anticipation. Whatever was behind that door, it was waiting for me. For a moment, I considered turning back, leaving the library, leaving the book, and never coming back. But something deep inside me, something I couldn't explain, pulled me forward. I had to know what was behind that door. With trembling hands, I reached for the handle. It was cold to the touch, and for a moment, I thought it wouldn't budge. But with a soft groan, the door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that seeped out from below was cold, musty, and thick with the scent of old books and something else. Something faint, like the lingering scent of incense or candles long extinguished. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, holding the lantern out in front of me, trying to see what lay below. But the light barely penetrated the shadows. The staircase seemed to go down forever, disappearing into a void of blackness. The whispering started again, faint and distant, echoing up from the darkness below. "Come down." My hands tightened around the lantern, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I didn't want to go down there. I didn't want to see what was waiting in the depths of the midnight library. But I knew, deep down, that I had no choice. Taking a deep breath, I stepped forward, the wooden stairs creaking beneath my weight as I descended into the dark. The staircase groaned beneath my feet, each step sounding louder than the last in the heavy silence. The lantern flickered in my hand, casting long, trembling shadows on the stone walls. The air grew colder as I descended, thicker, as if the darkness itself was pressing in from all sides. The whispers were still there, faint but ever present, curling through the air like smoke. I couldn't understand the words anymore. They seemed to blend together, an endless, disembodied murmur that followed me deeper into the shadows. I didn't know how far down the staircase went. The steps seemed to stretch on forever, spiraling down into the earth, the narrow passageway growing more claustrophobic with each step I took. I kept my eyes fixed on the small circle of light cast by the lantern, trying not to think about the overwhelming darkness pressing in around me. The book was still in my other hand, its weight heavy, almost pulling me down. I hadn't dared open it again since the words had appeared, but I could feel its presence, like it was somehow alive. I wanted to throw it away, leave it behind, but I couldn't. Something about it made me keep it close, even though every instinct told me it was dangerous. After what felt like an eternity, the staircase finally ended. I stepped off the last stone step and into a long, narrow hallway. The walls here were different, smoother, carved out of the stone, and lined with ancient, faded tapestries that seemed to ripple faintly in the lantern light. The air was musty, thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something faint and metallic, like old blood. I shivered, gripping the lantern tighter. The whispers had grown quieter now, but they were still there, lurking just beneath the surface of the silence, as if they were waiting for something. The hallway stretched out before me, disappearing into the darkness. At the far end, barely visible in the dim light, I could see a large, ornate door. It was different from the others, larger, grander, with intricate carvings etched into the wood. The crescent moon symbol was carved into the center, larger and more elaborate than before, surrounded by swirling patterns that reminded me of ancient, forgotten languages. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. Every part of me screamed to turn back, to leave this place, to run. But I couldn't. I had come this far. I had to know what was behind that door. Taking a deep breath, I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing softly in the stillness. The door loomed larger as I approached, the carvings seeming to shift and move in the flickering light of the lantern. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, but before I could touch it, the door swung open on its own. With a slow, creaking groan. Beyond the door was a massive, circular chamber. The walls were lined with tall, narrow shelves, filled with books, thousands of them, all bound in worn leather, their spines cracked and faded with age. But these books were different. I could feel it the moment I stepped inside. The air in the chamber was alive, thick with something old, something powerful. The books hummed softly, like they were vibrating with energy, as if they were waiting for me. In the center of the room stood a single, tall pedestal, and resting on top of it was another book. This one was much larger than the one I had been carrying, its cover dark and glossy, the crescent moon symbol gleaming in the dim light. As I stepped closer, the whispers grew louder again, rising from the bookshelves around me. But this time, they weren't just random murmurs. They were speaking to me. The final book, the last page, your story. My breath hitched in my throat. The whispers swirled around me, their voices soft, insistent. But I couldn't focus on them. My eyes were locked on the book on the pedestal. I reached out slowly, my hand trembling as I touched the cover. The moment my fingers brushed the surface, a shock of cold ran through me, freezing me in place. My vision blurred, and for a moment, the room seemed to spin. And then, slowly, the book opened on its own. The pages turned, one after another, flipping through in a blur, too fast for me to read. The whispers swelled, louder and louder, filling the room until it felt like they were inside my head, echoing through my thoughts. Finally, the pages stopped turning, landing on a single blank sheet. And then, just like before, words began to appear. This time, it wasn't just my name. It was my entire life. The words formed quickly, faster than I could keep up with, recounting every memory, every moment of my existence with unnerving accuracy. My childhood, my teenage years, my job at the bookstore. It was all there, written out in perfect detail, as if the book had been watching me my whole life. I took a step back, my heart racing, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the page. The words continued to appear, recounting everything that had happened that night. The man in the bookstore, the envelope, the midnight library, the staircase, the whispers. And then, at the very bottom of the page, the final sentence appeared. The story ends here. I stared at the words, my blood running cold. The story ends here. Before I could react, the book slammed shut, the sound echoing through the chamber like a gunshot. The whispers stopped abruptly, and the room fell into a deafening silence. I took a step back, my mind spinning. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in, the air thick and oppressive. I turned to leave, but the moment I did, the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. I ran to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The walls around me seemed to pulse with energy, the books humming louder now, vibrating on the shelves. I was trapped. The whispers returned, louder than ever, their voices overlapping, becoming a chaotic chorus that filled my mind. The story ends here. Your story ends here. You were never meant to leave. My chest tightened, panic clawing at my throat. I banged on the door, desperate to escape, but the room seemed to shrink around me, the shelves pressing in closer, the books vibrating with an unnatural energy. And then, from behind me, I heard it, the soft creak of footsteps. I froze, my hand still on the door, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, growing louder with each step. I turned around, my heart pounding in my ears. Standing in the center of the room, where the book had once been, was the man from the bookstore. His pale face was twisted into that same unsettling smile, his dark eyes gleaming in the dim light. "You came," he said softly, his voice echoing through the room. "Just like I knew you would." I backed away, my hands shaking. "What is this?" What do you want? The man's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. This is the end, he said simply. Your story was always meant to end here. I shook my head, my mind racing. No, I whispered. I'm leaving. I'm not part of this. The man stepped closer, his presence suffocating. The Midnight Library chooses its own, he said, and it has chosen you. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The walls were closing in now, the books vibrating with a strange, otherworldly energy. I could feel the room shifting around me, warping, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. The man took another step forward, his eyes locking onto mine. You belong to the library now. I was cornered, trapped in that suffocating chamber, with the man from the bookstore standing between me and any hope of escape. The walls felt like they were closing in, the very air heavy and oppressive, as if the entire library had come alive and was breathing around me. The books on the shelves vibrated, humming louder, their energy building into a low, unsettling roar. The man's smile never wavered as he stepped closer, his pale face illuminated by the flickering light of the lantern. His eyes were cold, almost lifeless, but filled with a twisted kind of satisfaction. I could feel the weight of his gaze, locking me in place like an invisible chain. You belong to the library now, he repeated, his voice smooth and calm, as if he were simply stating a fact. The Midnight Library chooses its own. I shook my head, backing further into the corner, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. No, I don't belong here. I didn't ask for this. I'm leaving. The man tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. You're already part of it, he said. The moment you opened the book, you became part of the library's story. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my mind racing with panic. I glanced down at the book I still held in my trembling hands. The book that had written my entire life out on its pages, recounting every memory, every choice I'd ever made. And now, with that final chilling sentence, it had written my ending. The story ends here. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a place filled with old books. This was something far more powerful, far more dangerous. The Midnight Library wasn't just a collection of stories. It was the place where stories came to end. It had been waiting for me, drawing me in, ever since that strange man first handed me the invitation. And now, I was part of its final chapter. The man stepped closer, his figure looming over me, and for the first time, I could feel the unnatural cold that radiated from him. It was like standing next to an open grave, the air thick with the scent of decay and forgotten things. This isn't real, I whispered, more to myself than to him. It's just a nightmare. It has to be. The man's smile widened. Oh, it's real, he said softly. You see, the library doesn't just hold stories. It holds lives like yours. And once the library has written your story, there's no going back. I shook my head, my hands trembling. No, I won't let this happen. I turned toward the door, desperate, my hand fumbling for the handle once more, but it still wouldn't move. I yanked on it, panic building in my chest, but the door remained sealed shut, as if the very walls were conspiring to trap me inside. The whispers swelled again, louder now, echoing through the chamber, their disembodied voices blending into a chorus of chaos. My head spun, the air thick with the weight of their words. The story ends here. It ends here. It always ends here. The man reached out, his cold, skeletal fingers brushing against my shoulder. The moment he touched me, a surge of icy cold shot through my body, freezing me in place. I gasped, my breath fogging in the air as the temperature plummeted. I could feel the pull now, something deep, ancient, dragging me deeper into the library, into the pages of the book I held. I tried to move, to break free from the icy grip that held me, but my body wouldn't respond. The man leaned closer, his breath cold against my skin. "The final chapter is written," he whispered. "And now, it's time to close the book." I could feel the life draining from me, as if the book itself was pulling me in, absorbing my very essence. My mind raced with terror, my thoughts spiraling into panic. Was this how it ended? Was this the fate of everyone who stumbled into the Midnight Library? But then, through the haze of fear, something clicked. The book. The book had written my life, my story, but it wasn't finished yet. I still had the book in my hands. With a burst of adrenaline, I tore my arm free from the man's icy grip and threw the book to the floor. It landed with a thud, the pages flipping open to that final, ominous sentence. "The story ends here. Number." It didn't have to end. I dropped to my knees, grabbing the book, and before I could think twice, I took the pen from my pocket. My hand shook violently, but I scrawled furiously on the blank page beneath the sentence. "The story continues." The moment I wrote those words, everything changed. The whispers stopped abruptly, the room falling into complete silence. The man froze, his expression flickering with something I hadn't seen before. Surprise, or maybe fear. The cold grip that had held me captive vanished, and I could feel the air around me shift, the weight lifting. I stood up, the book clutched in my hands, and I could feel its power changing. The pages flipped wildly, as if the library itself was trying to fight against what I had just done. But I wasn't done yet. I grabbed the pen again and scrawled the next sentence on the page, my heart racing. The door opens. Behind me, I heard the groaning creak of the door as it swung open, the stale air rushing into the chamber. The man's cold eyes widened, his smile vanishing as he reached for me. But it was too late. I darted toward the door, the book still in my hand, and without looking back, I ran. The hallway stretched out before me, but this time, the walls didn't close in. The whispers were gone, replaced by the sound of my own footsteps echoing off the stone. I didn't stop, didn't look back at the chamber, or the man, or the thousands of books vibrating on the shelves. I just ran, up the narrow staircase, past the rows of shelves that seemed to stretch on forever, until finally I reached the front door of the library. I burst through it and into the night air, the cold wind hitting my face like a slap. The street outside was silent, the world seemingly untouched by the horrors that lay within the Midnight Library. I stumbled forward, my heart still racing, and I didn't stop until I reached the street corner. Far away from the building, I stood there, gasping for breath, clutching the book in my hands. The library door was closed now, the building dark and still. For a long moment, I just stood there, my mind reeling, trying to process what had just happened. I looked down at the book in my hands. The cover was smooth, the pages still blank, but it no longer felt like a threat. It felt unfinished, as if I had taken control of the story now. I had written my own ending. For the first time that night, I felt a flicker of relief. I was out. I was alive. And the library hadn't claimed me. But as I turned to walk away, I glanced back at the building one last time. The crescent moon symbol above the door glimmered faintly in the darkness, and from deep within the shadows, I thought I saw a figure standing just inside, watching.